First of all, it's a pleasure to be here. I want to thank Petroleum Authority, UNOC, and all the partners, Total, who have invited young people onto the platform. And I think this is a step in the right direction. Why this is a step in the right direction is because we, as a country, are just nascent in the idea of the oil sector. And we need to take it from the generation that will go forward with it, and as opposed to just the generation that is managing it currently. Why I'm saying that is because if you're talking about your oil sector running a minimum of 30 years actively, you're talking about the next generation of engineers, of petroleum managers, of all kinds of people looking at those revenues over a 30-year period. 30 years is pretty much my age. So I'm just imagining my entire life and I do not know about this thing. That's not supposed to be the case. We are supposed to nurture our young people so the country is in concert in the oil sector. The most important thing for me is that we already have participation of young people. But that participation has always been on the easy part, because everyone can tell you how global warming starts and what causes global warming. So it's easy to mobilize everyone to oppose anything that contributes in that direction. What I think just transition discussions do is that they now present us with the questions of the alternative. And the young people who have been engaging in this climate conversation, at least until last year, have been young people that have been majorly dealing with, let us not do what contributes to what is wrong. And the concept of just transition has not been in the conversation. The concept has been on how much emissions are you now increasing Uganda by because you're beginning to exploit these resources. And I think that moving away from that to say, why must we do it in our real estate, in our real situation as Uganda, is where the just transition conversation starts from. So there are 2 points I want to first make. Just transition cannot be cheap and it cannot be very fast. Let me give you an example. Last week, at the conclusion of the subsidiary bodies negotiations in Bonn, Germany, there was a discussion around Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, and they couldn't agree on, those negotiations could not agree adoption of a particular phrase of text. Global North countries and all oil-producing countries refused the adoption, even in text. They've already rejected practice, but even in text, of the phrase emissions avoidance. Why? Because they do not see it as something they can adopt, however willing they are for this just transition, because it doesn't sit well with their current situation as a country and how much they are getting by having emissions. So in the negotiations for oil contracts and how you phrase your language, they said that texture, emissions avoidance, should not be there. They prefer words like net zero, prefer words that allow you to be able to progress with your resources while talking aloud about what must be done to curb emissions. Now, when a young person from Uganda goes to the conference of the parties and the only rooms they are sitting out on, or the only areas they are accessing, are areas of protesting EACOP, then they are not able to learn that actually the people who are funding COP are saying, do not use such language because we are not yet ready for that motion at that fast pace. Therefore, the first place that we need to have young people participate more is in the policy context of the oil sector, oil and gas sector. It is there that you understand the nuances that inform why countries move at whatever pace they move at in the conversation of just transition. Saudi Arabia, that has 40% of its GDP in the oil sector, and that is the reason they are in the global north, cannot agree that you must shut down immediately without thinking about their people. To say, what will happen to the people of Saudi Arabia? Where will they get opportunity? That's a country that's already in the global north. Here, you have a Uganda that is in the bottom of the global south. We're not the last, but we are down there.
Bottom
of the global south.
The global south.
Yes.
Those are two bottoms.
Yeah, so that's where we are. In that context, you do not have competitive university education on a global scale. You do not have competitive education. Right now we are talking about free basic education. In other words, if you go to a USE school, you should not be talking about access to internet, because we can't afford that as a country. We are committed to it, but we can't immediately afford it. In that context, that country needs to utilize all its resource envelope to create the investment boom that can drive those other economic driving sectors up before you can say that those young people will have opportunity outside an emission sector like the oil and gas sector. That is what the just transition is. And if young people do not understand that, then you end up with young people who are serving the funding requirements of the global north, who are at the same time rejecting them for themselves. They are saying we don't want a phrase like emissions avoidance, but you go and shout on the streets of Kampala so that ECOP doesn't happen. If ECOP delays by 5 years, that is 12% of our GDP delayed by another 5 years in terms of what we could earn from the oil revenue. What that means in terms of Uganda's infrastructure, education, skills development, technological advancements is immense. What it means in terms of the jobs these very young people are saying we don't have is immense. So I think that the first place, put young people in the negotiating rooms to learn. And that's the first thing the National Youth Council did when we took up climate programming. We were able to insist that Uganda must have young negotiators, and we put them there to be understudies. Today, I think we have about 2 young people who have never gone to any oil and gas school, but they can negotiate with the professors because of that endeavor. The second thing that I think is very important to recognize is that just transition itself is not cheap. If you talk about the amount of money that you need, okay, let me do something that's really cool. The Tesla vehicle is a really cool vehicle. It's owned by Elon Musk. Young people will probably relate nicely. But the reality is, the lithium-ion battery that the Tesla vehicle uses costs, in some instances, more than the majority of the cars you see in the Ugandan road. The Spacio, the Primo, those Tata cars young people have. Just setting up your own Tesla, before we talk about setting up the charging infrastructure around Uganda, does not have private investment capacity on this continent, except if Dangote and maybe LML will say we want to do it. But I don't think Sudil has the money that can set up the infrastructure here in Uganda, first of all. So the reality is that the money that you need to do those things cannot be gotten by getting a loan. It must be money that you generate internally if you do not want your debt to GDP ratio to be unattainable. And that's why even in the global north, where we would assume that money exists, the majority are still not transitioning, because the cost of transition per capita, per individual, is still very high vis-a-vis the cost of maintaining the net zero conversation. What is net zero? Plant enough trees to absorb enough emissions that you actually produce, and you'll be fine. Uganda is actually below net zero. We are not in a situation of we emit more than we consume. But the reality is that that is where young people need to understand the conversation. I would like to end with this. I think development must be maintained to be about people. I am a young politician. I wouldn't want a situation where I care more about which principles internationally Uganda is adhering to that keep Ugandans poor. I'd like to quote the president. He said, look, Africa finds itself in a predicament. Even if we were to develop all the sites on all the rivers in Africa with renewable energy, hydroelectric power, we would still not have enough electricity to power the country of the United States of America. What that means is that you need to think about alternatives that can work for yourself. And those alternatives cannot be driven if you're trying to behave like United States of America, like the countries that have so much than the population can provide. If you forget anything I've said about the just transition, you must remember this as young people. Number one, the next conference of the parties this year will be held in Azerbaijan. The Azerbaijan economy is only able to host because of the oil boom of 1970 through 1995, before the volatility of prices came alive. That is how Baku was built. If you look at how UAE was built right now, everything UAE was because of oil. But that first happened before they were able to host conversations that can stop oil production and so on. But even when you look in the foreseeable future, 20, 30 years, every expert is predicting that you're not going to have the global north agree to anything to do with immediate cessation of oil production, because their very economies would become global south economies. So the global south, therefore, should have it as a birthright to say exploit, reach them, and then we apply the first in, first out principle. If you produced your oil in 1960, Uganda should not quit oil first when we are starting in 2010. Let the one who started in 1960 first stop. Then we can come in. That's what is just, that's what is fair. I thank you.